In the heart of London, where history and tradition flow through every stone, the royal guards stand in silence. To most visitors, they appear as statues in scarlet and black, unmoving and untouchable. Cameras flash, tourists whisper, and children stare in wonder at their stillness. But behind the stoic posture and the tall bearskin cap lies a truth few outsiders understand. These men and women are not simply ceremonial figures. They are soldiers, trained in the harsh realities of combat, carrying experiences that reach far beyond the palace gates. This is a story about a clash between arrogance and discipline, between spectacle and reality. It begins with a man who thought his trophies and titles made him invincible, and a guard who showed that true strength is measured not by performance in the spotlight, but by control in the face of real danger. The morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the polished stones of the palace courtyard, igniting the air with a quiet majesty. Tourists clustered in uneven groups along the railings, their chatter rising and falling like the waves of a restless sea. Children pointed, parents raised cameras, and lenses clicked in eager succession. And in the center of it all, silent, stoic, unflinching, stood the figure that had drawn them here. A royal guard, scarlet coat pressed to perfection, tall bearskin cap crowning his immovable posture. He was more monument than man, more symbol than soldier in the eyes of the tourists who watched. Among the crowd that morning, one man did not see a monument. He saw a stage. Adrian Cole stepped out from the throng, his designer tracksuit gleaming beneath the soft light, the glint of a luxury watch flashing with each swaggering movement of his wrist. His presence was electric, radiating the confidence of a man accustomed to applause. At 32, he carried the weight of 3 international martial arts titles, the ownership of multiple high-end training studios in California, and a legion of online followers who hailed him as unbeatable. His life had been curated into a living brand, undefeated, untouchable, unstoppable. To Adrian, the guard standing rigidly at his post was not a soldier. He was an opportunity. "Look at this," Adrian muttered with a smirk, his voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "A fighter who doesn't move, who doesn't adapt. In my world, that's a man already defeated." The 4 men who flanked him chuckled knowingly. They were his training partners, loyal disciples in matching jackets, emblazoned with the insignia of Cole Combat Systems. One of them nudged him. "Remember Tokyo last year? That Swedish champ who thought he was untouchable? Dropped in 40 seconds?" Adrian grinned, teeth white against the morning light. "Exactly. This," he gestured at the still figure of the guard, "is the same story waiting to happen." Edward Hale, 28 years old, 8 years into his service, and a survivor of more battles than he cared to count, stood unmoving. His eyes stared forward, locked in disciplined focus. He had endured the arid heat of Afghanistan, the jagged uncertainty of Syrian cities, and the unblinking darkness of midnight operations where one wrong sound meant disaster. Compared to those nights, standing here, motionless before a curious crowd, was not a burden. but a quiet honor. Adrian, however, saw none of this. To him, Edward was a statue wrapped in tradition, an actor in an outdated pageant. "See the problem?" Adrian said, raising his voice so more of the tourists could hear. "This guy's vulnerable. He has no stance, no center of gravity. In real combat, that gets you killed." He rolled his shoulders, muscles shifting beneath the tailored fabric of his tracksuit, every movement calculated for effect. His body was a weapon honed through thousands of hours in the gym, and he was eager to prove it to a crowd hungry for spectacle. Cameras swiveled. Whispers rose. Some visitors chuckled, amused by this unsanctioned performance. Others frowned, uneasy at the aggression simmering just beneath Adrian's theatrical confidence. On the far edge of the courtyard, a figure paused. Colonel Richard Stanton, retired after 3 decades of decorated service with the Royal Marines, recognized the storm before it broke. His seasoned eyes scanned Adrian's posture, his restless energy, the telltale bravado of a man looking for trouble. Stanton's medals, pinned discreetly to his lapel, caught the morning light as he watched with measured concern. Adrian stepped closer to Edward. His sneakers squeaked faintly against the stone as he shifted into a fighter's stance, circling with deliberate fluidity. He jabbed the air, fists snapping just short of Edward's chin, each strike calculated to prove a point. "See? Always moving. Always ready. That's a real fighter, not this puppet." The tourists murmured uneasily. A mother drew her daughter away, muttering about disrespect. An elderly woman with a small veteran's pin shook her head, disapproving. But Adrian thrived on the attention. He raised his voice, slipping into the role of showman as easily as he slipped into a defensive stance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, gesturing toward Edward with theatrical flair, "what you're witnessing is the difference between British tradition and actual combat effectiveness." His entourage tightened their semicircle, subtly cutting Edward off from the wider crowd. In the space of minutes, the courtyard had been transformed from ceremonial ground into an improvised arena. "This," Adrian continued, motioning to one of his companions, "is Jin, 3-time international kickboxing champion. And this is Marcus, former welterweight MMA title holder. Real fighters, not costume soldiers." The crowd shifted, uncertain whether to laugh or to protest. Adrian relished their divided attention, mistaking discomfort for fascination. He threw another series of punches, stopping inches from Edward's chest. His movements were lightning fast, precise, dripping with the kind of control honed for judges and spectators. "Every move I make," he said loudly, "is designed for one purpose: victory. Not ceremony, not spectacle. Victory." Colonel Stanton moved closer, his military bearing parting the crowd without a word. His face was calm, but his eyes never left Adrian. He knew the moment was teetering on the edge. He knew that if Adrian pushed one step further, Edward would be forced to respond. Not as a performer, but as the soldier he was. Adrian, however, was oblivious. He circled again, grinning as he drew more phones into the air, more lenses capturing his impromptu show. He leaned close, his breath brushing against Edward's stoic cheek. Not even a blink. That's not discipline, folks. That's fear. Fear of breaking the rules. The tourist gasped as he unleashed a spinning kick that whistled past Edward's ear, close enough that the guard must have felt the rush of displaced air. Cameras snapped. A few people stumbled backward. Still, Edward did not move. His orders were clear. Maximum restraint. Absolute composure unless directly threatened. He was the embodiment of that discipline. His stillness a shield stronger than any counterattack. Adrian mistook it for weakness. "I think," Adrian announced with the gravity of a seminar leader, "we need a demonstration. Theory is fine, but nothing teaches like practice." He began stretching his shoulders, rolling his neck, warming up as if stepping into the ring. The air thickened with tension. Even his entourage shifted nervously now, sensing that the line between performance and provocation was vanishing. Colonel Stanton took a step forward, voice low but firm. "Son, you're making a serious mistake." A broad-shouldered member of Adrian's group intercepted him, palm pressing against Stanton's chest. "Let the demonstration finish, old-timer." Stanton's eyes narrowed, voice sharpening with authority. "That guard is not what you think he is." Adrian ignored the warning. He raised his voice to the crowd once more, preparing his finale. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'll show you why this so-called defense fails against real fighters." His stance shifted, body coiled with the kinetic energy of a man who had spent his life preparing for applause. The courtyard fell silent. Breath caught in throats. Fingers hovered above camera shutters. Every eye was locked on the man who believed he was about to prove his superiority, and the guard who stood still, waiting. What Adrian didn't know was that the stillness he mocked was not weakness. It was patience. It was restraint. And when that line was crossed, restraint would give way to something he had never truly faced before. The courtyard of Buckingham Palace had always been a place of quiet ceremony, where precision and discipline unfolded like a ritual under the watchful eyes of tourists. But now, that ritual was dissolving into something darker. The air no longer carried only the sound of camera shutters and murmured commentary. It carried tension, the taut, invisible thread of a spectacle spiraling out of control. Adrian Cole stood at its center, chest rising with theatrical breath, his lips curled into the smug grin of a man drunk on attention. His entourage had sealed the perimeter, their matching jackets forming a wall of intimidation. Behind them, the tourists looked in unease. Phones were raised not for the charm of tradition, but for the drama of confrontation. What had begun as arrogant mockery was becoming a performance too sharp, too real. "Ladies and gentlemen," Adrian shouted, his voice echoing across the stones. He gestured toward Edward Hale as though presenting an exhibit in a cage match. "Here you see the difference between a soldier who only performs and a fighter who truly understands combat." Edward remained motionless, eyes forward, shoulders square, his crimson coat glowing under the sunlight. But inside his chest, his breath was measured, even, the same rhythm he had relied upon in firefights when panic was death's invitation. He heard the taunts. He felt the air shiver as Adrian's jabs skimmed close. But none of it pierced his discipline. For the tourists, the unease was splitting into factions. Some frowned and shook their heads, muttering about disrespect. Others leaned in with guilty fascination, enthralled by the arrogance of Adrian's display. An American visitor whispered to his wife, This is better than any show in Vegas. She frowned back, tugging at his sleeve. It's wrong, she said. He shouldn't be doing this. Colonel Richard Stanton pushed forward, weaving through the crowd with quiet authority. His instincts screamed that the situation was seconds from breaking apart. He had seen this kind of energy before. On deployment, when young men let bravado drag them into dangers they couldn't comprehend. He recognized Adrian for what he was. Not a warrior, but a performer blinded by his own reflection. Adrian paced again, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet, his voice rising. Do you see? Not a blink, not a twitch. That's not bravery. It's fear. Fear of reacting, fear of breaking rules. And rules don't win fights. Gasps followed as Adrian lashed out once more, a blistering sequence of punches, each stopping just shy of Edward's chest. He spun at the end of the combination, sweat flicking into the air as he landed in perfect balance. The tourists erupted, some clapping nervously, others booing outright. Edward's silence was louder than any noise in that courtyard. His stillness drew a line between duty and chaos, and Adrian mistook it for cowardice. Watch closely, Adrian crowed, sweeping his hand dramatically toward the guard. I'm teaching you all a lesson in reality. His eyes flicked toward his entourage, and one of them cracked a grin, egging him on. Colonel Stanton's voice cut through the murmurs. That man is not a prop for your show, he said, sharp and commanding. Heads turned toward the retired colonel, his presence suddenly undeniable. He looked every inch the officer he had once been. Posture straight, jaw set, eyes steady. Adrian's group closed ranks, forming a wall between Stanton and their leader. One, tall and broad with a fighter's broken nose, barked out, Stay back, old man! Let the champ finish his demo. The colonel's gaze narrowed, and though his voice remained even, it carried the edge of steel. You don't know what you're dealing with. That guard is more soldier than any of you will ever be. But Adrian thrived on opposition. Oh, really? He sneered, turning back toward the crowd. I've fought champions across 3 continents. I've broken men who thought they were unbreakable. This soldier, he's chained to rules. He can't fight me. He won't. A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. Some parents pulled their children closer. A German tourist muttered, disrespectful fool, under his breath. Others, phones raised, leaned closer, unable to resist the unfolding drama. Adrian threw another strike. This one, a vicious kick that stopped inches from Edward's thigh. The air popped with the speed of the motion. Still, Edward did not react. His training whispered restraint, patience, control. He was waiting for the line to be crossed. The moment duty shifted into action. See? Adrian said, arms spread like a victor. Nothing. No defense. No awareness. A fighter who can't fight. He stepped back, rolling his neck, soaking in the audience as if he were in an arena beneath glaring lights. It's almost sad, isn't it? He said mockingly. Years of standing still, teaching yourself to be helpless. The words grated in Stanton's ears. He took another step forward, every part of his bearing broadcasting warning. Enough, he growled. You're out of your depth. Adrian's grin only widened. Depth? This is shallow water to me, old man. Watch This statue's about to crumble. The tension was unbearable now. The crowd had gone nearly silent, breath caught in throats, as if London itself had paused to witness arrogance crash against discipline. The click of a single camera shutter echoed like a gunshot. Edward's gaze never wavered. He had stared into the eyes of men with rifles raised, had held his breath through the silence before an explosion. This was no different. He knew the difference between performance and threat, and he knew Adrian was about to cross the line. Adrian's entourage shifted restlessly, their earlier bravado thinning under the weight of Colonel Stanton's warning and the guards' unyielding stillness. Yet Adrian himself was beyond caution. He thrived on spectacle, on the intoxication of risk. He drew in a long breath, then exhaled slowly, his muscles coiling. His eyes glinted with the reckless hunger of a man about to gamble everything on a single strike. "It's time," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Colonel Stanton braced, his hand twitching at his side as if he could intervene by will alone. The tourists leaned forward, phones rising higher, all sound vanishing but the pounding of anticipation. And at the center of it, Edward Hale remained unmoving. Not weak, not fearful. Waiting. Waiting with the patience of a soldier who knew that when arrogance finally struck, discipline would answer. The courtyard had tightened into silence, the kind of silence that feels alive, charged, expectant, fragile. Tourists held their breath, their phones raised high, eyes fixed on the man who believed himself unstoppable and the soldier who refused to move. Adrian Cole bounced once on the balls of his feet, every muscle alive with restless energy. He had performed this finale 1,000 times in the cage, in gyms, in exhibitions where applause drowned out doubt. It was his signature, his exclamation point. Now he meant to etch it into stone, right here at the gates of Buckingham Palace. He spun, the motion smooth and rehearsed, a blur of black fabric and coiled muscle. His heel arced through the air, the rotation powered by years of trained precision. In that split second, the entire courtyard seemed to slow, each person aware of the inevitability of impact. The sound, when his foot connected with Edward Hale's head, was sharp, startling, a crack that echoed against the walls of the palace like a gunshot. The bearskin cap launched into the air, tumbling across the sky before crashing to the stones with a muffled thud. Gasps tore from the crowd. A woman shrieked. A man swore under his breath. Several children clutched their parents in alarm. Adrian landed with practiced grace, absorbing the force of his own spin. His lips curled into a triumphant smile, as if to say, "See, I told you." He straightened, arms spreading outward to the crowd, like a victor basking in glory. But the celebration froze on his face. Edward Hale had not fallen. He had not even staggered. His head had snapped with the impact, a thin line of blood tracing down from his temple, but his feet remained rooted, his spine like iron. His eyes, unmoved until now, shifted at last, locking onto Adrian's with chilling clarity. There was no fear in those eyes, no pain, no hesitation. Only the cold, focused gaze of a man who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. "Oh," one of Adrian's entourage whispered, his bravado bleeding away. The crowd, sensing the shift, fell into an even deeper silence. Time stretched thin. Even the flutter of pigeons overhead seemed muted. as if the world itself leaned in to witness what came next. Colonel Stanton's expression changed from concern to grim anticipation. He had seen this before. The moment when restraint dissolved and the soldier beneath the ceremony revealed himself, Edward Hale moved. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was economical, efficient, terrifyingly fast. His ceremonial rifle clattered to the stones as his boots carried him forward in a single stride. In an instant, the distance between them collapsed. Adrian's instincts kicked in. He dropped into a defensive stance, adrenaline flooding through his veins. "Now we're talking," he said, though the hollow edge in his voice betrayed his bravado. Edward didn't answer. His fist did. The strike landed with the brutal precision of a professional who had drilled the same motion until it was muscle memory. Adrian blocked high, but the sheer force still sent him stumbling backward. The crowd gasped again, a ripple of shock rolling through their ranks. Adrian recovered, swinging with the reflexes that had won him trophies across continents. He launched a kick, fast and powerful. But Edward was faster. He caught the leg midair, twisting sharply, and Adrian crashed to the stones with a grunt, his breath knocked from his lungs. Phones shook as tourists struggled to keep filming, their own hands trembling. Parents shielded children's eyes, but curiosity pulled others closer. Edward dropped to one knee, pressing it firmly into Adrian's sternum, pinning him to the ground with minimal but effective pressure. Adrian's arms flailed, seeking leverage, but Edward's subtle adjustments nullified every attempt. It was not flashy. It was not meant to impress. It was meant to end the fight before it could begin. "Stay down," Edward said at last, his voice calm, steady, carrying not anger, but command. The words froze Adrian in place. He had spent years surrounded by cheers, adulation, and referees. But here, pinned beneath a soldier's weight, he felt something he had not known in a long time. Helplessness. Colonel Stanton stepped forward now, his voice cutting through the stunned crowd. "Mr. Cole, you've just had a practical education in the difference between performing combat and living it." Adrian writhed, his pride battling the reality pressing down on him. He can't." "Yes, he can," Stanton interrupted firmly. His tone was calm but sharp as steel. Guard Hale served with the Special Reconnaissance Regiment. 4 deployments, 2 commendations. You attacked a man who has faced real battle and lived. The crowd stirred, whispers swelling. "SRR?" someone murmured. Another man shook his head, muttering, "No wonder." Adrian's entourage, once cocky and defiant, had gone pale. One of them whispered, "Those guys, they're ghosts." Edward's knee remained steady, his breathing calm despite the scuffle. The thin line of blood traced down his cheek, but his face was expressionless, professional. "You've mocked discipline," Stanton continued, addressing both Adrian and the crowd. "But the discipline you've ridiculed is the very thing that keeps soldiers alive in places where your trophies mean nothing." Adrian's struggles slowed, his eyes wide with dawning realization. His voice cracked. He didn't even blink. "No," Stanton said, "because he knew. He's endured worse than your kick. That wasn't bravery you were mocking. That was control." Palace security hurried across the courtyard, radios crackling. Their commander's expression hardened as he took in the scene. The cap on the ground, the blood on the guard's face, the martial artist pinned beneath him. "That's a serious offense," the officer said grimly. "Indeed it is," Stanton replied, nodding. "Assaulting a serviceman on duty, disrupting ceremonial responsibilities, provoking violence on royal grounds. The list will be long." Edward glanced toward his officer for instruction. At a subtle nod, he released Adrian and rose with quiet efficiency, resuming a stance of attention despite the smear of blood on his temple. His composure returned as if nothing had happened. The tourists, shaken, murmured among themselves, their admiration transformed into respect. The guard they had thought was a statue had revealed the truth. Beneath the scarlet tunic and bearskin cap was a soldier tempered in fire. Adrian remained on the ground for a moment, chest heaving, pride shattered. His entourage avoided his gaze, their earlier bravado replaced with silence. Edward did not look at him again. His duty was not personal. It was service. And as the courtyard slowly exhaled, one truth had been etched into every witness. The stillness of the guard was not weakness. It was strength. Strength born of battles invisible to the tourist's eye. Strength that needed no applause. Adrian Cole lay stunned on the cold courtyard stones, breath wheezing through his chest as he tried to shake off the shock. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had imagined applause, imagined gasps of admiration, imagined a triumphant video clip bouncing across social media feeds. Instead, all he had was the weight of failure pressing down on his pride, and the soldier standing above him like a mountain carved from iron. Edward Hale didn't gloat. He didn't sneer. He didn't even glance at Adrian with satisfaction. His eyes had already moved back to their forward, disciplined stare, even though his body was still crouched low, ready. He looked less like a victor and more like a man performing a simple duty, neutralizing a threat and ensuring the safety of those around him. Adrian coughed and rolled to his side, trying to regain balance. His instincts screamed to rise, to fight back, to prove he wasn't beaten. But Edward didn't give him the chance. With a fluid motion, Edward's boot stepped forward, his hand pressing against Adrian's shoulder, pinning him with precision that wasted no energy. It wasn't rage driving him, it was training. The tourists saw none of the showmanship that had marked Adrian's performance earlier. They saw instead a demonstration of military efficiency. Every movement Edward made was tight, controlled, economical. When Adrian swung an arm upward in a desperate punch, Edward redirected it effortlessly, turning his wrist and folding him back onto the stones without so much as a grunt. The crowd gasped again, but this time it was not in shock. It was in awe. They were witnessing the unraveling of arrogance, thread by thread, against the loom of discipline. "Get off me!" Adrian barked, rage mixing with desperation. His voice cracked, lacking its earlier swagger. He tried to drive his knee upward, but Edward shifted his weight just enough to neutralize the strike. He might as well have been trying to fight the earth itself. Edward's face remained impassive, his breath steady. He didn't raise his voice, didn't play to the audience. He simply leaned closer and said, in a voice low enough for only Adrian to hear, "Every move you make, I've already learned to counter. Stop." The words sliced through Adrian more deeply than any strike. In the ring, He was accustomed to counters, but always with an air of competition, of rivalry. Here he realized Edward wasn't competing. He was controlling. There was no contest. There was only command. Colonel Stanton watched with the calm gaze of experience. He didn't interfere because there was no need. What he was seeing wasn't brutality. It was mastery. Edward was demonstrating what years of operational discipline looked like, and Adrian was being taught the harshest lesson of his career. Adrian flailed once more, fueled by raw pride. He rolled his hips, trying to leverage his weight, but Edward shifted again, subtle as the tide. His knee pressed firmly into Adrian's sternum, pinning him like a butterfly under glass. Each attempt to resist ended faster than it began. "Why won't you fight me properly?" Adrian growled, his words laced with humiliation. Edward finally met his eyes, cold and unwavering. "Because this isn't a fight. This is me ending a threat." The simplicity of the statement stung. Adrian had built his career on battles fought for titles, for medals, for the roar of the crowd. But here, in front of hundreds of tourists, all of that seemed hollow. This wasn't a battle between equals. It was an operation. And Adrian was the problem being neutralized. The tourists murmured among themselves. "He's not even breaking a sweat," someone whispered. Another added, "That fighter's got nothing against him." Phones captured every angle, and in the lens of each recording device, Adrian Cole's aura of invincibility was dissolving. Edward adjusted his hold once more, pressing Adrian flat, and then rose to his feet with measured calm. Adrian scrambled up, fueled by a stubbornness that refused to die. But Edward's response was instantaneous. A simple sidestep, a pivot, and Adrian was slammed back onto the stones with a clean, controlled sweep. The crowd winced in unison, but Edward didn't flinch. He didn't even look like he had exerted himself. Adrian lay there panting, his muscles trembling with both exertion and humiliation. For the first time in his adult life, he realized that all his titles, all his trophies, all his accolades meant nothing against the weight of real battlefield experience. "Stay down," Edward repeated, his tone still calm, still commanding. This time, Adrian listened. Colonel Stanton stepped forward, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of finality. "You wanted to prove yourself against discipline. You've just learned what it looks like when discipline fights back." Adrian closed his eyes briefly, chest heaving. He wanted to scream, to deny, to lash out again. But some part of him, some buried, honest part, knew the colonel was right. Edward straightened his uniform, ignoring the blood on his temple, and returned to a parade ground stance. The tourists, who had moments ago seen him as a ceremonial statue, now regarded him with a reverence that came not from tradition, but from truth. Adrian tried to sit up, but the colonel's voice stopped him cold. "Don't. The only thing you can salvage from this moment is humility." Adrian froze, the weight of the words cutting deeper than any wound. He dropped his gaze, no longer able to meet the eyes of either the soldier or the officer. Edward's silence said everything. He wasn't there to humiliate. He wasn't there to punish. He was there to serve, and that service had been rendered. For the first time, Adrian understood the difference. The courtyard was still echoing with the aftermath of the clash. Tourists who had once treated the changing of the guard as a quaint spectacle now stood hushed, their phones lowered, their faces pale with what they had just witnessed. The scarlet uniformed figure, who only moments earlier had seemed like a ceremonial statue, was no longer simply a guard. He was something far more formidable, revealed in the span of a few breathtaking seconds. Edward Hale had returned to his stance of stillness, blood drying faintly on his temple, chest rising with even breaths, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. His composure was eerie in its completeness. Adrian Cole, still on the stones, sat hunched, chest heaving, the fire of arrogance smothered to embers. His entourage lingered nearby, eyes cast down, their defiance gone. Colonel Richard Stanton stepped forward. His presence alone seemed to fill the courtyard as he positioned himself in front of both the humbled fighter and the transfixed crowd. His voice carried, not with volume, but with authority so refined it demanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping over the tourists, "what you have seen here today is not theater. It is truth, a truth many fail to recognize, but one worth understanding." The tourists leaned in. Their unease shifted into curiosity. They had come for tradition, but now they were about to receive revelation. "This man," Stanton said, gesturing to Edward Hale, "is not merely a ceremonial figure. He is a soldier, an active duty soldier, whose presence here is not pageantry, but proof of discipline. You mistook stillness for weakness, but what you witnessed was discipline forged in real battlefields, not performance stages." The crowd murmured, eyes darting between the colonel and the guard. Stanton's voice sharpened, each word deliberate. "Many ask, why have such men stand here, motionless, guarding symbols instead of fighting wars? The answer is simple. These duties are rotated. The man you see today, in ceremonial uniform, may have been in Afghanistan a year ago, or conducting counterterrorism operations only months before. And 6 months from now, he may be deployed once again into conflict zones most of you will never hear about in the evening news." A ripple of astonishment moved through the onlookers. An American tourist raised a tentative hand. "But why? Why make them stand here if they're that skilled? Doesn't it waste their ability?" Stanton's eyes softened slightly, though his tone never lost its firmness. "It is no waste. To guard this palace, to stand still under the weight of ceremony, is not lesser than combat. It is part of discipline. Do you think standing motionless for hours, under provocation, surrounded by noise, requires less strength than firing a weapon? Number. It requires a different strength, one of mind, of restraint. The same control that allows a soldier to endure a crowd's taunts is what allows him to stay calm under enemy fire. It is all connected. Ceremony and combat are not opposites. They are reflections of the same discipline." Murmurs spread through the group, expressions changing as the truth sank in. What they had dismissed as outdated pomp was revealed as another face of military readiness. Adrian lifted his head, his pride burning with shame, but even he couldn't deny the weight of Stanton's words. The colonel turned his eyes toward him, addressing not just the man, but the idea he represented. "Mr. Cole, you spoke loudly of combat, of fighting for victory, of defeating opponents under rules and lights. But in war, there are no referees. There are no trophies. There is only survival and mission success. A soldier, like Guard Hale, is trained for that reality. Every skill he has is honed not for applause, but for effectiveness. Stanton addressed the crowd again, his voice carrying the cadence of instruction drilled through years of command. Every guard you see here has proven himself before he ever dons the scarlet tunic. The uniform is not a costume. It is an honor, earned through service and sacrifice. When you laugh, when you taunt, when you think these men are merely for show, remember, you are mocking veterans who have stood in firefights, who have seen brothers fall, who have carried the weight of real combat. A woman near the front nodded solemnly, tears shining in her eyes. A child clutched her father's hand, staring up at Edward Hale with awe rather than curiosity. The atmosphere of the courtyard had transformed. Discipline, Stanton continued, is not about being unfeeling. It is about control. You saw Guard Hale take a full force strike to the head. Most men would have crumpled. He stood because he has endured worse. When you have lived through explosions that turn night into fire, a kick, even from a champion, is just another moment to absorb and move through. The crowd exhaled softly, understanding dawning like sunlight through clouds. Adrian lowered his gaze again, each word of the colonel another nail sealing the coffin of his arrogance. Stanton's voice took on a reflective edge now, less harsh, more contemplative. Tradition and ceremony are not relics. They are living proofs of values: discipline, endurance, loyalty. Without them, armies collapse into chaos. With them, soldiers endure. The guards you see here are not statues. They are reminders. Reminders that strength is not always in motion. Sometimes the greatest strength is in stillness. Edward Hale had not moved during Stanton's speech, not even to wipe the blood that still marked his temple. His eyes fixed ahead, posture unbroken, as if the lesson being spoken belonged not to him, but to the values he embodied. The tourists no longer raised their phones. Many lowered them entirely, almost ashamed to have treated the scene as entertainment. Respect now coated the air, heavy and sincere. Stanton turned finally toward Adrian once more. His gaze was piercing, but not cruel. You have skill, Mr. Cole. No one denies that. But you mistook spectacle for substance. You believed that discipline was weakness, that stillness was fear. Today, you learned otherwise. Learn from this moment, or it will be wasted. Adrian, for once, had no answer. He nodded faintly, shame flooding his features. His entourage shifted uneasily, their matching jackets now a reminder of the hollow show they had tried to stage. The colonel faced the crowd again. Remember what you have seen. The next time you watch a guard stand still and unmoving, do not see a statue. See the soldier beneath. See the discipline, the sacrifice, the service. With that, he stepped back, allowing the silence to settle. It was not the silence of arrogance or of ignorance anymore. It was the silence of respect, earned not by words alone, but by demonstration. Edward Hale remained unmoving. Adrian Cole sat broken, though not destroyed. Perhaps for the first time in his life, humbled. And Colonel Stanton, his role fulfilled, stood as the interpreter of truth, the bridge between those who had seen only pageantry and those who now understood reality. The courtyard had quieted, though the weight of what had transpired still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Edward Hale stood once again in his parade ground stance, scarlet tunic immaculate despite the dried smear of blood at his temple. He looked as though the fight had never happened. Tourists lingered, subdued, whispering in hushed tones, their faces marked by reverence rather than excitement. Adrian Cole, however, remained on the stones, pride shattered. His entourage hovered nearby, but gave him space. Their earlier arrogance dissolved into silence. Palace security moved in with efficient precision, surrounding Adrian. The commander, a stern officer with clipped tones, addressed Stanton directly. "Colonel, we'll take it from here. Charges will be filed. Assaulting a serving soldier on duty, disrupting ceremonial duties. The Crown Prosecution Service will have much to say." Stanton nodded, his eyes flicking once toward Adrian, then back to the officer. "Handle it thoroughly. A lesson has already been delivered, but justice must follow." Adrian was lifted from the stones, his wrists restrained with professional ease. There was no violence in the arrest, only procedure. Yet each click of the restraints seemed louder than gunfire in his ears. His chest rose and fell, shame washing through him in waves. For the first time in years, he was not in control. He was escorted into a side building, away from the tourists whose eyes burned holes in his pride. The walk felt longer than any fight he had endured. Each step was a reminder that arrogance had led him here. Inside the stark security office, he was seated at a plain table. The room was devoid of spectacle. No cheering fans, no cameras flashing in support, no championship belts. Just sterile walls, a single officer writing notes, and the weight of silence. Adrian shifted uneasily, sweat prickling his neck beneath the fabric of his tracksuit. Minutes stretched. Then the door opened. Edward Hale stepped inside. He had changed from his ceremonial scarlet into a combat uniform, green and brown fatigues that seemed to suit him more naturally. The bruise at his temple was visible but minor, his posture as straight and calm as it had been on the parade ground. He looked less like a guard and more like the soldier he truly was. Adrian rose instinctively, respect he hadn't expected himself to feel pulling him to his feet. His pride screamed against it, but something deeper insisted he stand. The security officer nodded and stepped out, leaving the two men alone. For a long moment, silence filled the room, thick and charged. Finally, Adrian spoke, his voice stripped of bravado. "That was SRR training, wasn't it?" Edward's gaze held his, calm but unreadable. "I adapt techniques to requirements. That's all you need to know." Adrian let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "I've trained with Special Forces guys before. 3 different countries. None of them moved like you. I wasn't ready for that." Edward did not react, did not confirm or deny. His silence was heavier than words. Adrian gestured to the chair opposite. "Sit, please." I need to say, this face-to-face Edward moved deliberately, lowering himself into the chair. His posture remained military straight, hands resting lightly on the table. Adrian leaned forward, elbows pressing into the surface, his expression earnest. "I screwed up," Adrian admitted. The words were raw, cutting at his throat as he forced them out. "When I saw you standing there, I didn't see a man. I saw a target. I thought you were just ceremony, tradition dressed up for tourists. I thought I was exposing weakness, but I wasn't. I was exposing my own ignorance. Edward's face betrayed nothing, but his eyes sharpened slightly, as if testing the sincerity behind the words. Adrian pressed on. In my world, everything's about proving you're the best. Titles, records, highlight reels. My ego's been fed by crowds and sponsors and likes on social media. But when I hit you, when you didn't fall, when you looked at me like... He trailed off, shaking his head. I realized I had no idea what real strength looked like. Edward finally spoke, his tone even. Few civilians do. That's by design. The stillness, Adrian said, leaning back. I thought it was fear. I thought it was weakness. But it was control, wasn't it? The same control that lets you stand there for hours while people laugh or shout or test you. The same control that keeps you calm when things explode around you. Edward inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the point without pride. Control is the difference between chaos and survival. Adrian nodded, running a hand through his hair, his expression weary. I've been chasing the wrong kind of strength. I thought fighting was about showing off skill, about proving dominance. But you showed me something else. Efficiency, precision, purpose. Edward's eyes softened just enough to suggest recognition of the humility in Adrian's tone. Different training for different purposes. You fight for points. I fight to complete objectives. Adrian swallowed hard, his throat tight. They're going to make an example of me, aren't they? Likely, Edward said, calm, but not unkind. Assaulting a guard on duty is taken very seriously. Adrian let out a long breath, resignation settling in. Fair enough. I deserve it. But before that happens, I want you to know I'm sorry. Not just for the kick, for the disrespect, for not recognizing what you represent. Edward studied him for a long moment, eyes measuring the sincerity in his voice. Finally, he gave a single, precise nod. Acknowledged. Adrian hesitated, then asked, almost in a whisper, when I kicked you, most men would have gone down. You barely moved. How? Edward rose, adjusting his fatigues. At the door, he paused, his voice calm, steady, almost carrying a trace of respect. When you've had real explosions detonate near you, a kick to the face is just another Tuesday. Without another word, he left the room, closing the door behind him. Adrian remained seated, the silence enveloping him once more. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the silence of humiliation, but the silence of reflection. He had walked into Buckingham Palace to prove his superiority. Instead, he'd been given a lesson in humility that no referee, no trophy, no arena could ever teach. For the first time in his life, Adrian Cole understood that there were different kinds of strength in the world, and his wasn't the greatest one. Morning broke over Buckingham Palace with a brightness that seemed to sweep away the shadows of the previous day. The courtyard glistened faintly from dew, the pale stones reflecting light that felt almost symbolic, a cleansing after the chaos. Tourists gathered once again, but this time their movements were subdued, their voices hushed. Something had changed. Edward Hale stood at his post once more, His scarlet tunic was immaculate. His bearskin cap returned to its place, his stance as rigid as ever. Yet those who now approached did so differently. Where yesterday there had been careless laughter and playful mockery, today there was distance, respect, even reverence. Cameras were still raised, but with quiet solemnity, as though capturing not an amusement, but a monument. Colonel Richard Stanton, making his usual morning walk, observed with a discerning eye. He noticed the subtle shift immediately. Families stood back rather than crowding too close. Children whispered questions to their parents instead of shouting. Even the brash tourists seemed restrained, as if some invisible boundary had been restored overnight. He paused near the edge of the courtyard, hands folded behind his back, gaze fixed on Edward. The young guard stood without flinching, the faint scar of yesterday's confrontation hidden beneath the shadow of his cap. Stanton allowed himself a small, private smile. The lesson had carried. Sometimes it took spectacle to reveal substance. Meanwhile, in the security office, Adrian Cole sat alone once more, but this time not as a prisoner awaiting charges. His release had been delayed as the formalities of legal proceedings wound their way through channels. Yet he had been granted a temporary reprieve, a space to reflect before facing the inevitable consequences. The silence was not oppressive now. It was instructional. He had spent most of the night replaying the confrontation in his mind, not the part where his foot had struck Edward's head, but the moments after, the way Edward had refused to yield, the way discipline had silenced arrogance. When Colonel Stanton entered the room, Adrian rose quickly, instinctively respectful. The older man studied him for a moment, noting the shift in demeanor. Gone was the swagger. In its place was a quiet seriousness. "You've been thinking," Stanton said simply. Adrian nodded, "More than I ever have after a fight." Stanton's expression remained firm, but not unkind. "And what have you realized?" Adrian hesitated, then spoke slowly. "That I've spent my whole life chasing the wrong kind of strength. I thought discipline was weakness. I thought stillness was fear. But now I see. It's harder to stay calm, to hold your ground, than to lash out. Edward showed me that." The colonel's eyes narrowed, gauging sincerity. "Words are easy. Change is harder." "I know," Adrian admitted. His voice cracked with honesty. "But yesterday, I learned more in 5 minutes than I've learned in 20 years of fighting. I know now that control isn't passive. It's power." Stanton stepped closer, his presence filling the space. Edward Hale didn't move until he had no choice. That's restraint, measured in steel. Many mistake it for fragility. You did. But it is the foundation of real strength. Adrian lowered his head. "I mocked what I didn't understand. And it cost me." Stanton's tone softened slightly. "You are not the first, and you won't be the last. Many civilians fail to see beyond the uniform. They see pageantry, not preparation. But now you have seen for yourself. The scarlet tunic is not a costume. It is a symbol, a reminder of those who have already proven themselves where it matters most." Adrian lifted his gaze, eyes steady. "I'll carry that lesson. Whatever happens with the charges, whatever people say about me, I won't forget it." Stanton regarded him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. If that is true, then something good has come of this. Outside, the morning ceremony unfolded as it always did. Guards marching in precision, rifles gleaming, boots striking in unison. But for those who watched, it was no longer mere spectacle. It was a demonstration of discipline, of unity, of unseen sacrifice. A young girl near the front tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mom, are they real soldiers?" The mother smiled gently, her eyes on Edward. "Yes, and more than that. They're guardians." The colonel overheard the exchange and allowed himself another faint smile. Sometimes the smallest voices understood the deepest truths. As for Adrian, when he was escorted later past the courtyard, he paused to look once more at Edward Hale. The guard never turned his head, never broke his stance. But Adrian didn't need acknowledgement. He saw what he needed to see. Stillness, not as silence, but as strength. For the first time in his life, Adrian Cole felt no urge to prove himself in that moment. No urge to dominate, no urge to boast. Instead, he felt gratitude for the lesson, for the humiliation that had birthed clarity, for the man who had unknowingly reshaped his understanding of what it meant to be strong. Discipline, he realized, was not about denying power. It was about directing it. Respect was not about bowing to another. It was about recognizing truth. And strength was not about winning at all costs. It was about knowing when not to fight. The palace bells rang in the distance, echoing across London. The tourists dispersed slowly, carrying with them stories they would tell not of spectacle, but of respect earned. And Edward Hale, ever still, ever disciplined, remained at his post, an immovable reminder that sometimes the greatest warriors are not the loudest, but the quietest. The story that began with arrogance ended with a lesson etched into silence. Adrian Cole came to Buckingham Palace convinced that strength was measured in trophies, in spectacle, in dominance. But one unyielding soldier taught him otherwise. Edward Hale, motionless and disciplined, revealed that true strength is not loud. It is steady, patient, unshaken even under attack. Colonel Stanton's words lingered long after the crowd dispersed. Stillness is not weakness, it is control. Ceremony is not theater, it is sacrifice remembered. Tourists who once treated the guards as curiosities left with new respect. And Adrian himself carried away the heaviest prize of all. Not a belt or medal, but humility. In the end, the scarlet tunic and bearskin cap were not costumes. They were symbols of service, endurance, and quiet power. And the guard who wore them remained where he always had, watching, waiting, unmoving. The world, for once, had learned to see.